All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Andy Hornbuckle from Spel Stormwater, and I'd like to thank you for coming onto this webinar and showing interest in this topic of the history of stormwater utilities in the United States of America. Just by way of introduction, I met Brian Chalfant in the United States in August last year. I attended a presentation that he did at a conference, and I was extremely impressed with his research and his knowledge. He actually did his PhD on this topic, and I've asked him if he would be a guest speaker for us, because I passionately believe that in Australia, stormwater utilities is something that we need to protect our creeks, our streams, our rivers, our lakes, our bays and our oceans from pollution. And what a lot of people don't realise is that the pollution, like you see in this picture here, which is of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, way out in the oceans, but this pollution actually all arrives in the ocean from land-based sources, from urban catchments. And a lot of people don't realise that. They just associate gross and plastic pollution with the oceans, but it's all coming from urban areas, and it's all travelling via the stormwater network from that urban area into the ocean. So whilst the stormwater network is the unfortunate conveyance system for this gross and plastic pollution to our oceans and bays, it also presents an awesome opportunity to I like to use the word stop that pollution getting there. We could say stem it, but I would rather say that we can stop it. That's a big, hairy, audacious goal that I've personally got. So on the screen here, I'm flashing up the website for Stormwater Shepherds. Stormwater Shepherds is an organisation that I've founded with a group of friends, and the whole point of it is that we're going to run on-the-ground, tangible pollution cleanups at hotspots in different cities across Australia, with a view to educating people that this pollution is occurring upstream in the catchment, sometimes hundreds of kilometres from the ocean. So if we can spread the word and get all levels of society familiar with this topic, that plastic pollution is actually associated is associated with stormwater, not just associated with the ocean, I think we're going to go a long way to fixing the problem. So you can have a browse on this website and get familiar. And there's a volunteer take up. You can contact us and put your name down to support us in this cause, which I'd really appreciate. And I'll just wrap up by saying that Brian's presentation, a recording of it, and also his PowerPoint will be available on the Spel Industry Forum within a couple of days, so that you can, if there's any content here that you would like to refresh with or share with other people, you can come to the Spel Stormwater website and get access to that information forever. So thank you very much. I'll let Brian do a more detailed introduction of himself and his credentials, which are impressive. And I'm confident that you will really enjoy this presentation. So thank you. Dan, our facilitator, if you could hand the screen over to Brian, that'd be great. Thanks, everybody. Have a Yep, I can see your PowerPoint now, Brian. I can't hear you. You must be muted. Oh, I still can't hear you, sorry. Dan, can you make sure he's unmuted? You there, Brian?
Yeah, is that coming through now?
Gotcha. Gotcha. Very good.
Okay, great. You can see the slides, yeah?
Yeah, you might just need to put it into PowerPoint view.
Yeah. All right. We good?
That's good. Excellent.
Okay. Yeah, so hi, everybody. As Andy said, my name is Brian Chalfant. I'm in the United States currently. And I appreciate the invite to talk to you all about some research I did, as Andy mentioned, for my doctoral dissertation looking at the history of stormwater fees in the United States. And I think it's a concept that can have pretty broad applicability. It's been, in addition to my research focused on the United States, but this concept has been implemented in a lot of other countries around the world. So I think it's definitely got some applicability to Australia and other countries as well. But I'll just talk about some of the lessons and kind of phenomenon observed in my research focused on the United States. So a kind of quick outline of my talk. Oh, and I should introduce myself a little bit. As I already mentioned, I did my PhD recently in public policy, and my dissertation was on stormwater fees. And I currently work for the state of Pennsylvania, the Department of Environmental Protection, coordinating stormwater, but as well as kind of water policy more broadly for the state Environmental Protection Agency. So I'll kind of leave it at that and get into the meat of the presentation here. So just a quick outline. First, touch on what stormwater fees are. Do a quick overview of my research, and then go into kind of the three main components of the research, looking at where the fees started in the United States, how they kind of spread from there, and what forms they've taken. And maybe we'll have some time for question and answers at the end. So what are stormwater fees? Pretty simple definition that stormwater fee is a recurring fee. Some places bill it differently. Some places do monthly. Some places quarterly. Some annually. Just the idea that it's a recurring fee. It's not like a one-time assessment. The second key feature of a stormwater fee is that it's assessed against a parcel of real property. So, a parcel of land that somebody owns is what kind of the billing unit is. And then the third, what makes it a stormwater fee, is that it's based on some estimate of demand imposed on stormwater drainage systems. And I think one of the easiest ways to kind of explain what that looks like is to look at an example. So we'll talk about the city of Cleveland in the state of Ohio in the U.S. This is the metropolitan sewer district for where the city of Cleveland is, right on Lake Erie here. And the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District is like the metropolitan sewer district for the city of Cleveland and about 60 other local governments in that area who provide sewer services and more recently stormwater well, they provided stormwater services for a long time, but more recently implemented a fee for stormwater. And what their fee looks like is, this is just a screenshot of their website. You can go on and look at in more detail if you like. The way they do it, they break it out into residential and non-residential fees. And they have various tiers depending on the size of the property. But kind of the key thing I want to focus on here is the kind of center column there, that the impervious surface area, the square footage or the areal extent of impervious surface area is what the fee is based on, which is a proxy for if there's impervious surface area when rain falls on it or snow melts, that water doesn't percolate into the ground, it runs off and creates demands on the storm sewer system. So that's what the kind of foundation of the fee system is, and that's fairly, I don't want to say universal, but 99% probably of the fees in the U.S. are based on impervious surface area or some kind of similar concept as that, some kind of estimate of the demands placed on a stormwater system. And you can see here the the billing amounts for these are in this case monthly bills. So for each of those kinds of properties, they get that amount billed monthly depending on where they fall in that in that kind of setup. This is just an example showing the football stadium actually in the city of Cleveland, where they've got a mapping, a GIS kind of web interface here that you can look up any parcel of property in the city, and they outline. They got some pretty slick aerial imagery and kind of post-processing to find out what the blue areas are showing, what's the impervious surface that's being counted towards their bill. The red outlines the parcels of property, and then you can see kind of green areas that are pervious soils that are not counted as impervious surface areas. So anybody can go in the that Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District can go on here and look up their property and see what they're being billed for, which I think is a really nice kind of communication tool so people can understand what this bill is for. And one way to think about stormwater fees is it's very similar in concept to other kinds of water fees, water utility fees. So for drinking water, typically fees are based on the amount of metered water use coming into a residence or place of business. That's what the bill is based on, is how much water is used. So it's kind of based on the amount of demand, how much water you demand from the drinking water collection, treatment, and just distribution systems. That's what the fee is based on. And drinking water and metering the water is that's practical to do. There's water meters going into the houses, but for stormwater, that's not really practical to meter what the stormwater running off of a piece of property is. So that's why places use things like the aerial extent of impervious surfaces as kind of a proxy for the amount of runoff in that sense. And you can think about like wastewater utilities too, where they provide wastewater collection and treatment services, and the fee is based on some kind of estimate of the demands on that system. Same thing with stormwater utilities, that amount of impervious surface serves as kind of a measure of the amount of demand for stormwater collection services that are being provided, conveyance services, and sometimes, depending where you are, other services like treatment, or other things that may be provided as kind of a service for stormwater. So that's kind of a way to think about it in kind of a suite of water utilities. Stormwater is kind of one of the key things that in the U.S. a lot of times before stormwater was more recently kind of looked at as kind of a separate utility, it got kind of lumped in with wastewater, especially in areas where the sewer systems are combined, where you had stormwater and sanitary sewage going into the same pipes. The bill was based on kind of the metered water use, but that stormwater piece wasn't really being accurately or precisely measured in that when it was lumped in with wastewater. So breaking out as a separate utility kind of gives them more, you're more accurately pricing the demand on the stormwater system, kind of as a separate system from a sanitary wastewater system. And these are just a couple of examples I like to show to kind of illustrate what I was just talking about, that if a place has a wastewater, if everything associated with stormwater is being billed through wastewater, like based on metered water use, a place like a high-rise office building where, well, let's think about it as like a high-rise hotel, actually, where there'd be, a lot of metered water use, but relatively, relative to the amount of metered water use, there would be relatively little runoff, because the aerial extent of if you look at it from the sky, the aerial extent of impervious surfaces there aren't that great compared to the amount of water being used. So if a place like that was just getting a bill based on metered water use, they'd be have a fairly large bill when their stormwater demand isn't that high. Whereas if you look at something like a parking lot where there's no metered water use, that contributes a lot of demand on a stormwater system. But if locality is the only way they're billing for stormwater is through metered water use. A place like a parking lot isn't going to get any kind of bill. So if you have a stormwater fee, that more accurately prices that demand that's placed on stormwater systems based on the amount of water that's generated when rain falls on there or snow melts off. And same thing for like a big box retail store, something where there's relatively little metered water use. Compared to fairly large footprint of impervious surfaces. So there's just kind of contrasting examples of if there's a stormwater fee in place, you can make an argument that that more equitably distributes the the burden of paying for the operation and maintenance and improvement of stormwater systems compared to if there was only that kind of more historically, at least in the U.S., that a fee only based on the amount of metered water use, kind of a sanitary sewer paradigm. So that's my quick overview of what stormwater fees are. I'll do a quick overview of my research as well, and then get into kind of the meat of the research. So this is the title of my dissertation. I'll do kind of a 30,000-foot view here today. If anybody wants to dig into it in more detail, that's the title of it. You can search it online, or there's a link there. And as Andy said, the slides will be available after the talk here, so you don't have to try to write that down right now. But that's the link to the dissertation if you want to dig into any of this in more details, or you can feel free to contact me. I'll give my email at the end of the talk here. But so my research kind of was broken into 3 parts, where looking at the emergence, diffusion, and form of stormwater fees in the U.S., and that'll be kind of the 3 things I talk about here, the 3 chapters of the webinar. So starting out with the emergence, looking at the first fee in the U.S. As far as my research could tell, at least the earliest or the first fee in the U.S. was in the city of Billings, Montana, in kind of the northwest part of the United States. And these are just a couple of newspaper articles from the time when, from local Billings newspapers, from the time when the stormwater fee was implemented. And as kind of the headlines here suggest, it was issued, the stormwater fee was implemented as a way to finance a bond issuance by the local government to expand stormwater. The city was growing at the time, and they needed to improve the drainage infrastructure in kind of the growing parts of the city where more people were moving to. And so they floated a bond to do that, and to finance the bond, they implemented this stormwater fee, which you can kind of see towards the bottom center part of the screen here. It lays out how the billing was broken down. So if it was 7,500 square feet or less of property. In this case, it wasn't impervious area; it was just total square footage. That would be 360, and I think these are monthly, if I remember correctly. But that's how they broke out the bill there. If you want to look at that in any detail. But this is just showing the plans of the storm sewer. These were new storm sewers that were being built, and this was what the bond issuance was going to finance, and what the stormwater fee was paying for that bond paying off that bond issuance over, I think it was a 20-year bond issuance. So everybody in the city got a stormwater bill to pay for this expansion of the drainage infrastructure in the city. And one thing I want to mention here, and you can actually see that, I'll actually flip back here a little bit, in the kind of that center slice of the slide here. There's it mentions that there was a dissenter for the the town council or the city council voted whether they wanted to approve the stormwater fee or not, and there was one councilor who was representing people who were opposed to the fee. And just to kind of give that idea that whenever these are rolled out, people don't like paying new fees. So if you're thinking about doing this where you are, be prepared for that resistance or kind of pushback on, from certain segments of the populace on, what is this new fee that I'm being charged? Why are we paying this? that's something to be prepared for. 'Cause in my experience, pretty much every place that these have been rolled out, some places do really good marketing and kind of collaborating with people before the fee and kind of building what the fee is going to look like, and that can go a long way to kind of minimizing the resistance that manifests whenever the fee is actually implemented, if you lay that groundwork ahead of time, kind of working with key stakeholders. But I also want to show that after the fee was implemented, there was a court case that was filed over it. So these things are contentious, and as I mentioned, I think that's a good reason to really think about how you want. If you're thinking about doing a stormwater fee, think about how to roll that out and how to kind of design the what the fee is going to look like based on the characteristics of where you are, because there's likely going to people don't like government sending the bills for things, so which is I think a natural thing, but there's ways you can prepare for that, and I think my message here is to expect that kind of that there's going to be some resistance or at least questioning of what is this fee, why am I paying it, and just in the case of the Billings, this first fee in the U.S., actually that court case that was filed went all the way to the state Supreme, not the federal Supreme Court, but the state Supreme Court, which upheld the fee because there was a lot of kind of thoughtful engineering work that went into it and kind of designing the fee, that the justices agreed that this was a reasonable thing because of the kind of the work that the local government had put into designing the fee. So that's a kind of quick snapshot of the Billings case, which was these are a few other examples of kind of early adopters of stormwater fees in the U.S. And I forgot to mention that Billings case was in 1964, was when they first implemented a stormwater fee, so over 50 years ago now. And these other cities that I've listed here, Bellevue, Boulder, and Portland, also implemented fees fairly early on, either in the late 60s or early 1970s. And I just wanted to mention that the Billings case, as I talked about, was the motivation there was to finance a bond issuance to expand drainage infrastructure in the city. The motivation for implementing stormwater fees, at least these early ones, varied quite a bit place to place. So I wanted to mention the Bellevue, Washington. Historically, there were very strong salmon runs there, and it was a big part of the culture there that the salmon, people were very proud to live in a place where there were such robust salmon runs. And as the city developed, kind of after World War II, in the 50s and 60s, people were noticing that the salmon runs were declining a lot because of runoff that was being generated by impervious surfaces and kind of the increased development in the city. So one of the big motivating factors for Bellevue implementing stormwater fee was that that kind of connection to the local ecology there, and that the connection that had with the culture and the economy and all kinds of aspects of life in Bellevue. So I just want to mention that the motivation for implementing stormwater fees varies place to place. But now I'm going to kind of zoom out from that case study to look at kind of the country as a whole over the last starting with that Billings case in 1964, how stormwater fees have spread across the United States since then. So this is a map of the continental U.S. There aren't, at least at the time I finished my research, there weren't any stormwater fees in Alaska or Hawaii, so I'm not showing those here. There's actually, I've been talking with some people in Alaska, and they're probably going to be one in Anchorage soon, the city of Anchorage soon. But this is, the continental United States, and basically anywhere you see a color on here, blue, red, pink, orange, yellow, that's somewhere that has a stormwater fee, and I'll explain more what the color coding means later, but you can see that there's lots of places across the U.S. that have, lots of local governments across the U.S. that have implemented stormwater fees. I think the last count was up near 1,700 approximately. And this is just a time lapse kind of showing the spread of the stormwater fees at play here. And I just want to note that if you watch after 1990 and after 2000, there's pretty steep takeoffs in the amount of fees that are implemented. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is on the next few slides. So there's a few lines on here. I just want to focus on kind of the most prominent, the most prominent black line there with the circle markers is the total number of stormwater fee, total number of local governments in the United States that implemented stormwater fees on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis is just time, the year. And I've got marked on here 1990 and 2000. I won't go into what the MS4, it's basically, it was federal regulations that were put in place by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that essentially required local governments to do certain things to abate stormwater pollution, abate the pollution that was created by runoff from development stormwater. So municipalities, municipal storm systems, which is what the MS4 acronym is, were required to kind of do more things to prevent the pollution from stormwater, and that has been a big motivating factor for a lot of places. And you can see on this chart that especially after these regulations were rolled out in 2 phases, and especially after that second phase, which was more expansive, regulated a lot more localities in the U.S., the number of stormwater fees really took off. And more recently, it kind of dips off here at the, since, I don't know what, like 2010 or so. And part of the reason for that is just a lag in the data collection. It takes a while for the survey that this data was based on to kind of recognize new stormwater fees and get that in the database. It's partly been because of some state-specific nuances that I'll talk a little bit about later on, with a kind of touching on Pennsylvania, which is where I'm most familiar with, where I live right now. And as I mentioned, I work for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So some of that has to do with some quirks of individual state governments that I'll talk about a little later. But this is a screenshot from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that, if you want to explore those federal regulations anymore, this is the website, the home website for information about what those regulations were. But basically, like I said, it's just the federal government required local governments to implement some various practices to better control pollution from stormwater discharges. And this is a map of what communities across the United States were regulated under those federal regulations. The green is the phase 1, which was the ones that were rolled out in 1990. The phase 2 is shown in blue here, which again were the regulations that took force in the year 2000. And what I wanted to show here, that I'm going to flip from this map to a map of where the stormwater fees are, which I'll flip back and forth here a few times. You can see there's pretty decent overlap between where the stormwater fees are and where the places that were regulated and where the stormwater fees are. It's not 100%, but the point I want to make here is that those federal regulations kind of increase the cost for a lot of local governments in terms of providing stormwater services, which has been a big motivating factor for a lot of places to implement stormwater fees as a way to finance those increased costs from the federal regulations. But as I mentioned, kind of touched on a little bit before, that especially if you look at the state of Pennsylvania, which I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but it's up in kind of the northeast part of the country. There's a lot of places that were regulated in under those MS4 regulations, those federal regulations, that did not implement stormwater fees. And what I have labeled here are just states in the U.S. states where there are no stormwater fees, or at least weren't at the time my research ended. And what I want to give a kind of talk about a little bit is why there aren't stormwater fees or weren't stormwater fees in some states. As I mentioned, I'll talk about Pennsylvania here. And part of the reason, there's actually been a kind of explosion of stormwater fees in Pennsylvania in the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years. And part of the reason for that and why there weren't stormwater fees broadly enacted before then was that the state statutes or the state laws weren't clear on whether local governments had the authority to implement stormwater fees or not. Based on the state statutes on what local governments can do weren't clear on that before. I'm showing here that this is an act that was passed by the state legislature in 2016 that specifically addressed that issue. That this act, clearly and explicitly said that yes, local governments have the authority, a specific class of local government, in this case, second-class townships, and there were a series of bills that were passed for other kinds of local governments. That these bills said that yes, these kinds of local governments have the kind of explicit authority from the state to implement stormwater fees if they so choose. It wasn't like a mandate saying they had to, but it was saying if they want to implement a stormwater fee, they have the authority to do that. And this was one example of, as I mentioned, this was kind of a suite of acts that were passed. After these acts were passed, enacted into law, then a lot more local governments, as I mentioned, in the past 3 to 5 years have really, there's I think close to 50 or maybe even 100 now local governments in Pennsylvania that just since these acts were passed have either implemented stormwater fees or in somewhere in the phase of designing it or having a vote on it. So that was kind of one key factor as to why, in the state of Pennsylvania, there weren't many stormwater fees until recently, was that those state statutes kind of giving that clear authority to local government saying, yes, you have the authority to enact this if you so choose. And the other kind of side of that is kind of harkens back to the Billings case that I mentioned, that court cases over as I mentioned, disputes over these stormwater fees are pretty common. Almost ubiquitous, I'd say. That, and the other reason why we see a lot of stormwater fees in some states but not in other states has been kind of the history of the court decisions over stormwater fees. And that I've got shown here a kind of listing of court cases. This is just a partial list. If you want to see the whole thing, again, it's in my dissertation, but this is just a partial list of some court cases that were specifically about stormwater fees in the U.S. And I've got highlighted here a few states. I'll focus here on the state of Florida, which is highlighted in yellow towards the middle of that table. That there have been a lot of court cases over stormwater fees in the state of Florida, and pretty much consistently, with a few kind of minor exceptions, the courts, at various levels of the courts, some, the highest court in the state, the Supreme Court of Florida, as well as some lower level courts like district courts of appeal, they've pretty consistently upheld the authority of local governments to implement stormwater fees. So there's those kind of two pieces, that there's the state statutes kind of giving the authority, and then how the courts interpret those statutes in court cases are kind of two pieces that are really important to whether stormwater fees have been broadly enacted by local governments in certain states in the U.S. where, in Florida there was pretty clear state statutes saying that local governments had that authority, and then that was followed up by, this series of court cases which, pretty generally upheld the authority of local governments, which is why, if you look back at some of those maps, Florida is actually, I think, the state with the second most stormwater fees in the U.S., and this is part of the reason why that, the legal framework kind of enabling local governments to implement stormwater fees is very, very supportive in Florida. Oh yeah, I've got the map here just kind of to show that the state of Florida in the far southeast part of the country is one of the places where there's the most stormwater fees in the U.S. So that's kind of a quick tour of the last 50, 55 years of stormwater fees in the U.S. and what have been kind of the big picture drivers. There's a lot of other things going on that I talk about in the dissertation, but those are kind of the couple big picture things as to what's been really influenced stormwater fees, how they spread in the U.S. And next, I want to talk about the what forms the stormwater fees have taken, which what I mean by that will be a little bit clearer when I get into it here. So here's where I'll talk about what the color coding means on this map. So anything in blue is a local government that has implemented a stormwater fee on an individual basis. So an individual city, there's various forms of local government in the U.S. There's cities, there's towns, townships, but those are local governments that have implemented a stormwater fee independently within their own jurisdiction. And then the red is county stormwater fees, which counties are kind of the next level of government up from a local government in the U.S. that in some places the county is the only government, where in some parts of the country there's also local governments, which I'll show in the next slide. But the red is county governments, and then the orange is a metropolitan sewer district, which you can kind of see pretty small in this picture, but that example I showed early on about the metropolitan sewer district of Northeast Ohio, or the Northeast Ohio metropolitan sewer district, that's shown in orange there along Lake Erie. And then pink, there's one that's based on a watershed stormwater fee that's for a whole watershed. And then the yellow, there's one instance of a few local governments got together and created basically another local government, a special local government that was just for stormwater, so they formed like their own like stormwater district. But I'll talk. Well, so yeah, I wanted to mention that the places where we see, so the green here is where there's those local governments, where there's cities, townships. And so what I wanted to show here is that there's some states where all of the land area pretty much is some kind of local government. And there's other parts of the country where the red's also local governments, but in areas where you just see the red, or states where you just see the red, especially in the western states, in those areas, when you go outside of like an individual city, you're not like in a city or another local government. The county has jurisdiction there. So that kind of difference in how local governments are set up across the U.S. is one of the reasons we see more county-based stormwater fees in western and southern states, is because the county has kind of more direct responsibility for managing stormwater in those areas. There's not necessarily cities or townships or other kinds of local governments that have jurisdiction over kind of broad swaths of land, which is, I just wanted to mention that kind of quirk of how local government's set up in the U.S. is part of the reason we see more county fees in the southern states and western states versus like kind of the north central and northeastern states. But I kind of wanted to wrap up here by talking about 3 case studies I did as part of my research looking at stormwater fee forms that, as you can see from that, I'll back up to the map here, most of these stormwater fees that have been implemented in the U.S., and some of the blue areas show up kind of small on this map, so they're kind of hard to see, but the vast majority of stormwater fees that have been implemented, I'd say over 95, 97%, are individual governments acting independently. So, a city that implements a stormwater fee kind of independently, not in coordination with any neighboring jurisdictions, but just implementing a stormwater fee for their own local jurisdiction. But as my research, there's a few examples, as I mentioned, of stormwater fees that have been implemented by groups of local governments on kind of a collective basis, and I'll talk about a few examples of those. One is going back to that example I showed at the beginning, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, which in that case it was as I mentioned, the Metropolitan Sewer District that provides sanitary sewer services for I think it's 61 local governments in that area. And they were set up to provide those sanitary services, and they were also providing stormwater services before, but then more recently they decided they were going to implement a stormwater fee. And in that case, it's a pretty broad program. It covers administration as well as kind of big capital projects where they're installing big kind of tunnels to store stormwater and retrofitting, putting in like some green infrastructure. So there's a lot of like kind of big ticket capital projects that are part of that program. And in order to finance that, they have a relatively high fee compared to, if you look at some other stormwater, it's not unbearable for people to pay necessarily, but if you compare it to other fees for some other programs, it's a relatively high fee because they've got that kind of broad program goals where they're looking to do these big capital projects. And in that case, it was a mandatory thing that all the local governments in that metropolitan sewer district, they didn't really have a choice about whether they wanted to participate in the metropolitan sewer district stormwater fee. And when they first rolled it out, there's individuals who opposed it, but that individual opposition in this case kind of rolled up to the next level and was expressed as certain municipalities or local governments were opposed to the metropolitan sewer district implementing the stormwater fee. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about what that looked like. So this is kind of a zoom in on the metropolitan sewer district, the Northeast Ohio, and the kind of inverted silhouette there shows the boundaries of the sewer district, and then the color coding shows green were local governments that supported the sewer district in implementing the stormwater fee, and the other colors, the red, orange, and yellow, were varying degrees of opposition to the stormwater fee. The red was kind of the most intense and sustained opposition that at some point the municipalities shown in red, orange, and yellow were involved in actual like court litigation. They sued the sewer district over the fee, saying that they didn't think the sewer district had the authority to compel local governments to basically pay the fee. In that case, the litigation there went on for like 5 years, and it was eventually went to the state Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court upheld the sewer district's authority to say, yes, you can do this collective stormwater fee and require all the municipalities or local governments in the sewer district to pay the stormwater fee. So it was, extensively litigated for 5 years, a lot of kind of court costs, but eventually upheld. And I want to just kind of contrast that with another stormwater fee, a collective stormwater fee in the southwestern part of the state of Ohio, the Hamilton County Stormwater District, where in this case it's a much more kind of narrow or constrained program where they don't do a lot of big capital projects. It's mostly like administration, especially involved with kind of the administrative requirements of those federal regulations I talked about earlier on, kind of handling the administrative part of meeting those the requirements for those regulations. And because they're not doing big capital projects, they have a relatively low fee, and it's a voluntary system in this case that if a local government wants to participate in the collective fee, they can, but they don't have to. It's not mandatory like the Northeast Ohio example I showed. In this case, because it's voluntary, there was no litigation about it, of course. And this is just a map showing the thick black border is showing the county, Hamilton County boundaries, and then the thin black borders are showing the local government, the cities and township boundaries. And all the local governments shown kind of highlighted in yellow there are local governments that were currently, at the time of my research at least, participating in the county fee, the collective county fee, where they all said, yes, we're going to participate in this county fee, and then the county kind of handles the billing of the stormwater fee for them. But there's also some, you'll notice this map, there's kind of some holes in it where kind of going right down the center of the map actually, which is actually where the main waterway in the area runs. there's a lot of local governments that don't participate in that collective stormwater fee. They've opted not to. And one big exception is the city of Cincinnati, which is kind of that big hatched area at the bottom. They don't participate in it, which is the place with the most population and the most land area. They've actually recently implemented their own fee, which is what the pink hashing there indicates, is local governments that have their own fees. So that's kind of a contrasting example from the Northeast Ohio, where it was kind of a mandatory thing involving all the local governments, and versus like a voluntary involving only the governments that want to participate. And then I'll just kind of wrap up here by this Allegheny County Sanitary Authority, which is in the city of Pittsburgh and surrounding area in the state of Pennsylvania. Currently, there's actually not a collective stormwater fee there because, as I mentioned before, stormwater fees are newer to Pennsylvania. So there's kind of some things developing currently as local governments are implementing stormwater fees on their own, and there's talk about doing a collective fee there. And there have been some in other parts of the state since those state statutes were updated to kind of, as I mentioned before, give the local governments that authority to implement stormwater fees. But currently, there's just a few local governments in that Allegheny County area. And I should mention, the Allegheny County Sanitary Authority is the metropolitan sewer district for the Pittsburgh region. There's only a couple local governments that have stormwater fees so far, but there's some things developing since my research wrapped up that may be pointing towards a collective fee developing there. We'll kind of keep an eye on that. But kind of the lesson that I think we can draw from those case studies is that if a place is there, I think in a lot of sense a collective fee makes looking at a fee that's implemented by a group of local governments working together, it makes a lot of sense because the watershed boundaries are the catchment boundaries don't necessarily follow where the political boundaries are. So there's a lot of kind of efficiencies that can be gained by working on a collective basis in terms of where the water flows, but also in terms of like one-time costs or overhead. Those can be spread out more, and there's like better buying power with more local governments working together. But some things to think about if you're thinking about doing a collective fee is that if you're trying to have a more extensive or mandatory approach like the Northeast Ohio example, it may require these higher, whatever you want to call them, bargaining or negotiations or enforcement or litigation costs to get to that place where, because that Northeast Ohio was a mandatory thing, yes, it did require a lot of litigation and costly litigation over 5 years, but because of that, they were able to get through that and have the court uphold that, yes, they had the authority to do that collective mandatory fee. They're able to do these kind of bigger capital projects that they can kind of more strategically place their projects because they don't have to worry about, well, is this project in an area in a local government where they're not participating in the fee. So they can do get to some greater collective benefits and minimize the risks of people dropping out of the fee that Hamilton County one in Southwest Ohio. As I mentioned, the city of Cincinnati, they once did participate in that collective fee, but then dropped out, which was kind of a pretty big blow to the program there. They had to kind of recalibrate things pretty significantly after that city dropped out. So just some things to think about if you're looking at doing like a collective fee involving collaboration or cooperation among a bunch of local governments. So that's pretty much all I've got. Again, there's the title of my dissertation and the link. The slides will be available. I'll blow through that, but we got some time for questions. And there's my contact information as well.
Hey Brian, this is Tom Goodwin from Spel Stormwater. I'll be facilitating the Q&A now.
Great.
So if anybody anybody watching the webinar has any questions, please chuck them into the questions tab there. And I'll just start off with a question from Blair. Blair's asked, if you harvest stormwater for on-site use or treat stormwater on-site, is your fee reduced?
Yeah, so that's one thing I didn't talk about. Definitely, a lot of places that have stormwater fees in the U.S. have some kind of, they call it various things like a credit or a rebate program, so that if, say, a homeowner installs like a rain garden or rain barrels or something to reduce the amount of stormwater that flows off their property, then there's like a credit that's assessed that, you know, reduces the fee essentially. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, what's something like a solar rebate, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Right. The next question we have is from Chris. Chris says, a lot of the examples you've given are based on urban areas. Are there any examples of stormwater fees for agricultural areas relating to nutrient runoff? So we're thinking areas similar to like far north Queensland where we have the Great Barrier Reef, that kind of thing.
They're definitely in the U.S. at least more common in urbanized areas, the urban suburban settings, and actually there's a number of instances I came across in my research where a lot of the opposition to stormwater fees were from agricultural landowners, because, you know, they were saying that, yeah, there may be some impervious surface on our property, but there's so much pervious surface around it that it really doesn't put any demands on the stormwater system. So yeah, it's definitely more of an urban suburban phenomenon here. I haven't come across any instances where there was a stormwater fee specifically designed to address kind of costs associated with you know, like agricultural runoff, or, you know, there's nutrients associated with urban runoff, but like nutrients from agricultural runoff specifically, I haven't come across any instances of that.
Okay, great. So the next one we have is, and this might be different, I guess, like local government area to local government area. So Jack has asked, how do you calculate the impervious area of each property, through aerials, or was it more accurate on-ground surveys?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Tom, it definitely varies place to place, but a lot of places use aerial imagery as kind of at least the first crack at doing the, you know, measuring the impervious areas. Some places do, you know, kind of more detailed, I wouldn't say like necessarily like a census, but some places go out and like kind of, you know, will do like a survey or like kind of a spot check of certain, you know, start out with that aerial imagery, but then go and kind of ground truth, you know, based on like surveying on the ground, rather than, you know, kind of having that combination of the aerial imagery backed up by kind of on the ground, ground truthing.
Yeah, okay. So the next one we've got is from Rowan. So Rowan asks, is there any water quality or water quality contamination fees? What incentives do landholders have to encourage them to implement stormwater pollution controls? I suppose that's a little similar to, I guess, the first question.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any that are like specifically designed to address stormwater, like the water quality from stormwater. I mean, that's definitely a concern of a lot of places that implement stormwater fees, is reducing the amount of pollution. You know, it's not just handling the volume of stormwater that comes off, but also the pollution associated with that. But that's kind of a tricky thing to measure. You know, I mean, talking about like, you know, the kind of infeasibility of metering the volume of water is one thing, but then measuring the, like, what's the water quality coming off. I mean, that's, you could kind of come up with some way to do that based on the land use, I guess, but yeah, I'm not aware of anywhere that does a water quality based thing. But the kind of end point there that the question mentioned, talking about the stormwater fees are, you know, even based on just the impervious surface area, not necessarily water quality, are a way to incentivize kind of that, getting it back to that first question about, because there's this stormwater fee in place, it kind of incentivizes property owners to put in place practices that reduce the amount of stormwater, which a lot of those practices also have water quality benefits along with that, not just, you know, kind of controlling like that peak rate flowing off, you know, like the flow that's coming off, but also the pollution associated with that.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll try and speed through these. Got a fair few coming in, which is good. Michael has asked, are there reports that show that stormwater fees have been effective? Have you got any success stories?
Yeah, I mean, how you define success varies place to place, but there's definitely ones out there that are, kind of, I don't know, I'd say like leading examples. The city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania is one kind of, I think, a really interesting, what I call a success story. They've got a very detailed program, and they've got some really interesting things going on with how they do that crediting, and they've even got like a kind of market set up where there's some trading that they do, that if people are looking for kind of one of the, what I call the more innovative stormwater fees in the U.S., the city of Philadelphia is doing some interesting things, as is Washington, D.C.
Okay, yeah, great. The next one I got here says, thanks for your time. Thank you, Brian. In the state of New South Wales, we have a stormwater charge that local governments can levy. We are currently trying to adjust the conditions around this to uncap it and also encourage uptake. Do you have any lessons learned about implementing a charge like this?
Not sure I understand what so there's currently a stormwater fee, the questioner said?
Yeah, there is. We have a stormwater charge that local governments can levy, and I guess it's not adopted by every local government.
Okay.
And I guess maybe, yeah, do you have any lessons learned, any tips on implementing changes like these in your dealings with local governments?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that that can be done to kind of, I mean, one of the big things that's driven a lot of the stormwater fee implementation in the U.S., as I mentioned, have been these kind of regulatory drivers. So, there's the federal government or the state government has implemented regulations that have kind of put more costs on local governments and how they handle stormwater. So that's kind of been one of the big things. That I guess that's not probably something the questioner had in mind about implementing like state or federal regulations. But even just kind of within like a region, I think just showing like demonstration projects where local government that implements a stormwater fee, if they've got like some real, some kind of interesting or successful project that they've done with that stormwater fee revenues, then I think that's one of a good way to kind of show the appeal of stormwater fees and kind of get more uptake, is to kind of have those kind of marquee demonstration projects that show, look, these are the kind of things that you can do with a stormwater fee.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you. Look, we're probably getting close to the end, so I'll just do a couple of quick ones. So Beth has asked if there are, in your experience over there, if there are targets associated with the stormwater utilities, so peak flow reduction, that kind of thing. Are there set targets on those, or is it, I guess, is it more that you're doing something to reduce the peak flows and nutrients?
So that really varies place to place, and kind of one of the best practices for putting a stormwater fee in place is, before you put it in place, you kind of set up what are the program goals that you want your program to deliver, like what are the services you're trying to provide, and then once you kind of lay that out and kind of set out what is the budget associated with that, you can kind of back calculate based on the amount of properties in the area, what the impervious surface, or however you're going to base the fee. You can kind of, once you have that budget, you can kind of divvy it up and say, okay, this is what the stormwater fees going to be. But one thing I wanted to mention is that so I mean, I guess what I'm saying there is that as part of that designing the program, it depends what you want to put into that. If like achieving a certain peak runoff rate, controlling that to a certain extent is one of the goals, then that's something you bake into kind of the program from the beginning. But there's other places, actually in the state of Pennsylvania again, where the state government has required, partly because of the Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the big estuaries that parts of Pennsylvania drain to. There's nutrient pollution and dead zones and kind of all that fun stuff. To help clean it up, the state government has required that as part of the local government's stormwater permits, they have to achieve a certain amount of pollution reduction associated with those permits. So like 10% sediment load, I think it's 5% nitrogen and like 3% of phosphorus. They've got to like kind of ratchet that down every year with their permit. So that's one of the things that's, that wasn't like baked into the programs from the beginning. It was kind of one of those regulatory things that was kind of put upon the local governments.
Okay, yeah, right. This will probably be the last question, and it's been asked a couple of times. So in your experience, like it's kind of a two-parter. Like, what's the main goal of the stormwater utilities? What do you see these fees get used for?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say again, it varies, but it really varies place to place as to what they want to achieve, which is part of why I wanted to mention at the beginning some of those early fees that, the city of Billings, their interest there was to expand the drainage infrastructure and, kind of make more parts of the city more developable so the city could grow and people could, more people could move there, versus the, the Bellevue Washington example where their main driver was to kind of protect the salmon runs that were still existing and kind of restore the salmon runs to their kind of the state where they were before the city developed so much. Okay. So I mean, it really varies what the objectives of the particular program are.
Yeah, sure. All right. Look, thank you so much for your time, Brian, and thanks to all the attendees for showing up. Look, we'll be sending out like all the relevant links that are linked to this video for everyone who couldn't stay on for the whole time. You guys will, I guess, find that in your emails afterwards. But look, thank you very much, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Hal.